videographer has failed me. Okay, it wasn't recorded. I don't know whether I'll put it up. Okay, so Christianity in general is a very different form from what it was in the original, in the first century and maybe the early second century, but after that it started to change. Although there were changes even in the first century, but in general, Christianity pretty much followed as the Bible laid it out. But I think Jude rather, is beginning to see here that there are changes even in this time creeping in. So he's really emphasizing the fact that we need to go back and do what was originally set up. That's the important thing. So, contend for the faith delivered once and for all to the saints. Okay, we're going to concentrate on that more at the end. We may not get onto it until week after next, because this coming week Gary's going to preach and I'm going to be down in Wellington. But the next time I preach, that may be when we get onto it. Okay, so let's start from verse 1. Jude, a slave of Jesus Christ and brother of James. Now the word Jude there, if you translate it actually as it's written in the original, it's Judas. Judas was a pretty common name. There are a few fairly well-known Judases, as it's written in the original in the first century world. Judas Iscariot, maybe one of the most well-known. There is a Jude, or Judas rather, the brother of James. There's a Judas who was an apostle. I think the word Jude was, or rather the translators started to use the word Jude rather than Judas, simply because they didn't want to. Judas had developed a bad name. So rather than call these people Judas, which had bad connotations, they shortened it and used the word Jude. But pretty much every case where you see Jude written, the background word is actually Judas. Now, so the big thing is, who is this, or one thing is, who is this guy Jude? As I said, there is a number of prominent Judes in the early times. There's probably a lot more because it was a very common name. In Luke 6 and verse 16, we see there's a Jude that's an apostle. And when day came, he summoned his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he also named apostles. Simon, also named Peter, brother Andrew, James and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who is called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So there we have the apostles. That is one possibility. Often it was apostles. Like Peter was an apostle, he wrote a number of books. Paul was an apostle. He wrote the majority of the books in the New Testament. But then you've got Luke, who wasn't an apostle. So in this case, it may be this Jude. But notice it says the son of James. Okay, then we've also got a Jude, probably the same one mentioned in Acts 13, so I won't read that. But then you've got Mark 6 and verse 3, where Jesus' family members are listed. And people are, people are thinking is getting a little bit pretentious because of his claims, which were true, we know. So in Mark 6 and verse 3, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Josie, and Judas, and Simon, are not his sisters here with us? Okay, notice there, it lists off the family members. You've got, is not this the carpenter? That's talking about Jesus, son of Mary, and brother of James. So the carpenter is the brother of James. And then Jose, Judas, Simon are all brothers of Jesus. So that makes 5 guys or 5 men in Jesus' family. But notice also, this is only a side note, and are not his sisters here with us? Notice it says sisters. It doesn't say sister. So that means in Jesus' family, there was at least 7 children. I said at least because it doesn't say how many sisters there were. But if there was just one sister, it wouldn't call them sisters in the plural. So Jesus had at least 7. But notice when Jude talks about himself in this introduction, he said, a slave of Jesus Christ and brother of James. The brother of James here must be, I think, the one listed in Mark 6:3, which is part of Jesus' actual family. So you've got the brother of James, Josie, they're all brothers. Judas, James' brother, Simon's a brother, etc. They're all brothers. Whereas in Luke 16, it does say of James, and Judas the son of James. So the one here in the beginning, it's talking about the brother of James. Probably what that means is the Jude here is Jesus' brother. And that's generally what commentators in general, the vast majority of commentators will say they believe the Jude here is Jesus' brother. It's interesting that he just calls himself a slave of Jesus. He doesn't refer to himself as the brother of Jesus, but rather the brother of James. Jesus' brother James was also very prominent in the church in Jerusalem. To me, that kind of gives the idea that Jude, although they were physically related to the physical Jesus, he saw Jesus as being a different, in a sense, being altogether. He kind of, I think, felt like he didn't have the right to call him his brother. That gave him unnecessarily authority in the situation. But he refers himself merely as a slave. There's a lot of discussion as to what doulos means, and that's the word for slave here. But really it does mean someone who is owned by someone else, and so has the responsibility to serve that person. And slavery was very common in this particular time. Not only in the Romans, although they did a lot of it, but others took slaves as well. And it's all through the centuries it's been common. So this Jude was more than likely Jesus' brother himself. Okay. Now the next part of that verse 1 is to those who are called, loved in God the Father, and kept for Jesus Christ, may mercy and peace and love be multiplied to you. One thing you notice when you go through this book, that Jude uses the combination of 3 things very, very often. One of the methods which is very common as far as preaching is concerned is the 3-point sermon. You have an introduction, then you have 3 points, then you have a conclusion. That's the 3-point sermon. In fact, it's a very effective way of preaching. I don't tend to do it much anymore. I did a lot before, and it is a very effective way of preaching. Your brain tends to work in 3s very often. If you dump a whole lot of things on a person, 7, 8 things on a person, they very often can't remember them afterwards. You have just 3 points, very often they'll remember them. 3 points also means you can divide the section into segments, and when you divide into segments, it's easier to remember as well. For technical, it's called clumping. You know, if you organise things into a clump of things, you can remember that a lot more than just a string of things. But you can have 12 things, but if you put them into 3 different groups, you'll remember them much more easily than just 12. And that seems to be what he's doing. He uses this idea of repetition of 3 very often. So notice here, he says we are called, we are loved, and we are kept. Jesus is doing that for us. Called here, I think, has to be seen in combination with all of these things. I know in Matthew 22:14 it says, many are called, but few are chosen. So sometimes called means just people are told the message, God is calling them through that message, and then whether they obey it or not. Depends whether they become a Christian, whether they're saved or not. Sometimes called is used in that way. Sometimes it means those who have gone through the whole process and responded to the message and become Christians. Here, it's obviously these people he's referring to are Christians. They are called, they are loved, and they are kept. Notice, loved in God. So God loves them. And they are kept. This translation says for Jesus Christ. Your translation may have something different. The Jesus Christ there is in the dative form. You may not know what that means, but basically, when it's in the dative form, there is no for in the actual text. It's just the verb kept and then the dative form. When you use a dative form, it can be translated either for or in or by. So this could mean we are kept for Jesus Christ, we are kept in Jesus Christ, or we are kept by Jesus Christ. Could be any of those. There's an interesting, all of those are good, by the way. I don't think we need to decide which is which. It's just a comment I'm making. There's an interesting passage, I'm not going to go through this whole thing because it's pretty long, in John 17 verses, altogether it's through 6 through 19. And this is Jesus' basically final prayer that he made before he was arrested and before he was crucified. And he basically prays for the apostles who he's been spending time with, he's taught, and he's getting them ready for when he goes and they have to take over the work of spreading the word and establishing the church. And this passage has a lot of the elements of the idea of being kept. So in a sense, although specifically he's talking about the apostles in this passage, we can apply it to ourselves as well. But more specifically, it's the apostles in this particular thing. Notice I've highlighted the things I want to bring out. He's revealed the message to those you gave me, and that is emphasized over and over again. God gave these men to Jesus. They were chosen because God, in a large way, had already decided they were suitable. And they gave them to Jesus he gave them to Jesus to make use of. And I love it, the same with us. In a sense, we have been given to Jesus by God by being chosen to serve Jesus Christ. We made the decision to do it, sure. But we would not have been able to make that decision unless God had sent the message out to us and given us the opportunity. So I think to a large extent that applies to us as well. So you have given them to me. Then if you drop down verse 9, you have given me because they are yours. And then in verse 12, I have kept them in your name. I have kept them. I have retained them in the state which you gave them to me in. So when they became apostles, they became very privileged. And we become very privileged when we become Christians, when we choose to be baptized. Not only have I kept them in your name, I've guarded them. I've protected them from outsiders. And Jesus does that, God does that for us by giving all the arguments we need to counter those who try and draw us away from God. I think that's the idea of what he's meaning when he says we are kept. And then in verse 15, I did not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are kept from the evil one. And Jesus does the same for us. And then in verse 17, sanctify them in the truth, your word is true. They were sanctified because of their relationship. We are sanctified because of our relationship with God. A passage also that really brings this idea out is John 10:28 and 29. And I give them eternal life, and they will never perish forever, and no one will seize them out of my hand. No one will take them out of my hand. In other words, Jesus is holding us in his hand, in his protective hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one can seize them from my Father's hand. Now, I know people say that can't be right because people fall away. That's not what this passage is saying. If you want to stay as Christians, no one can prevent you from being a Christian and being saved. That's the point he's making. No one can draw you out. You can decide to jump out. I don't think it's addressing that at all. But that's what is meant by our being kept. And to me, that's a fabulous thing. You know, I may squander all my money. You know, I received an inheritance from Dad. I may squander it all. When I come to die, we're living in poverty. That can easily happen. You know, he loves nice clothes and boots. No, I'm only joking. I know I shouldn't say that because of what Proverbs said. Anyway. But if we truly want to be a Christian, there is no one can prevent us being a Christian. Even if the whole church leaves us for some reason, they go off in another direction and they are no longer doing what God says, we can still carry on and be faithful and be saved in the end. No one can prevent that. So when he says you are kept for and by whatever it is, Jesus Christ, I think that's a really beautiful saying about what God has done for us. Okay, now, as I said before, Jude changed his subject. We're going to drop down to verse 4, leave verse 3 at the moment. For or because certain men had slipped in, this one says stealthily. In other words, they've got, I did think of the word I wanted to use here, when you've got people, I can't think of it now. Infiltrators? Yeah, that's what, infiltrators. He spotted some infiltrators who have come into the church, wherever they are. He doesn't really say where specifically. Maybe it's a problem that's quite general. But anyway, these infiltrators have come in and they're trying to change the original teachings which Jesus was trying to get the people to follow. So certain men have slipped in stealthily. They haven't done it openly. They've come in claiming to be faithful Christians, but then they've set about trying to change things. You know, when you get a fifth column, they don't announce themselves as a fifth column. They work from within the system to try and change it. That's what's going on here. Notice he says who were designated long ago for this condemnation. He hasn't actually made much of a condemnation up till this point. So I think what he's referring to there is what he says in verses 5 through 16. There he really is condemning these particular people. See, ungodly, so designated long ago for this condemnation, ungodly ones who change. Now this is a participle, and an easy way to understand what a participle is just add ing on the end. So changing the grace of our God into licentiousness and denying the Master, the Lord Jesus Christ. So these people on the surface making out they're faithful Christians, but in fact they're trying to draw the members away into a dishonest lifestyle, or an ungodly lifestyle rather. There are lots of groups actually that, especially in the sexual area, claim to be Christians but promote immoral behaviour. One group I remember fairly clearly was a group called the Children of Love, which on the surface sounds like it'd be a wonderful group to be involved in. But the love was sexual love they were talking about, not real love like the Bible talks about. So there are other groups. Maybe you could put in that divorce, remarriage. Maybe that falls into that category as well. Or just immorality in general, which unfortunately happens over and over again in the church. And so Jude is very concerned about this particular problem. And these are the two main characteristics, seems like, of this group that is worrying Jude at this particular point. So they're changing the grace of God into licentiousness. And we know Romans chapter 6, we see that again in that discussion there. And this was an argument being made by people, shall we continue in sin in order that grace may increase? They were trying to say it's okay to sin, because if we sin, God's grace covers us. So the more we sin, the more grace He is, so we're actually doing something good, is what they were saying. And then verse 15, shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? And that's, even today you hear that. That's being legalistic. We don't live under the law, we live under God's kindness, and the implication for a lot of people is therefore we can do these things and it's okay. But that's exactly what these guys were doing. So I think Jude was justified in being concerned about what was going on. Sorry. He hadn't given me the signal, so it was a shock when I saw the times an idiot. Okay. And I'm not sure here whether the denying and the changing the grace of God, one is dependent on the other, or they're two different things. In other words, they could be denying Jesus because they are changing the basic beliefs. Or they could be two separate things altogether. Now, okay, so that's the group he's opposed to, he's concerned about. Now, the next section, and I won't spend too much time on this, you might say, well, these guys had no warning that what they're doing is wrong. And that's a common kind of thing people say. When something happens, someone says, oh no, that's wrong. And we say, well, you should have told me. I didn't know that. You should have told me. And that somehow justifies the fact that we've done something wrong. Jude counters that here by looking at examples that especially Jewish people would have been aware of, to show them how God condemns ungodliness. He always had all the way through the history of man. Now, and this is verse 5 of Jude. Now, I want to remind you, although you know everything once and for all, so I'm going to remind you, even though you know this, I want to remind you to make sure you don't forget about it, that Jesus, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, the second time destroyed those who did not believe. So he looks back at Israel's history, which they would have been very, very well aware of. And we know in the end only 2 went through into the promised land. All the rest ended up dying out without receiving the promise the promised land rather, which Jesus was leading them to. And the second example, the angels who did not keep to their own domain but deserted their proper dwelling place, he has kept in eternal bonds unto deep gloom for the judgment of the great day. I think that passage isn't found in the Old Testament, but I think 2 Peter 2, which 2 Peter chapter 2 is kind of a parallel of Jude. He mentions it. So look what happened to the angels. Even they were cast out of heaven because of not keeping to the rules. And then the third example, he said, as I said, he has lots of groups of threes in this. Sodom and Gomorrah and the towns around them indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire in the same way as these. These are these people who he's talking about. In the same way as these are exhibited as an example by undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. So Sodom and Gomorrah also is counted with this group of people who are being touted or given as examples of how God punishes the evildoer. That's his whole point. Ignorance is not an excuse, is what he's saying. And that applies to us as well. Now let's look at these particular men who has prompted this book. How do they fall into this category of people who are ungodly? Despite the warnings of history, in the same way also these men, notice it says because of their dreams. The word dreams here seems to mean dreams that are taken as visions, not just ordinary dreams. These men have dreamt this, and they've decided because they dreamt it, and they correspond probably to something they want, they claim they are having visions from God to do what they're doing. I had one of those, and I decided it was a vision from God or a message from God. It didn't work out, so I know it wasn't. So I'll give you a different example. There was a couple at Rdmayne when I was there. The guy had a dream that he was going to marry a particular girl, and he decided it was from God. He went and told the girl, and the girl decided it must have been a message from God as well, so she said, well, if that's what God's telling you, we better get married. They got married. Lasted about a year. That kind of seems to be what's going on here. They're having these dreams. They're what they want. So they're interpreting them as messages from God. And so they're doing what they shouldn't have been doing. The obvious implication, they really weren't. He calls them dreams, not visions, because that's all they were. They were just dreams from them, not from God. So, as a result of their dreams, they defile the flesh, and we saw that in the previous one, going after strange flesh, pretty much always talking about homosexuality. They defile the flesh, Sodom and Gomorrah. They reject authority, probably the angels in this particular case, and they blaspheme majestic beings. I think possible parallel there is Israelites, but it's not quite as clear whether he's got two sets of descriptions which all refer to the same, or he's actually two altogether. I kind of think that he's using those previous three examples and showing how these particular men are doing it. Okay, I'm going to have to finish there. Time's pretty much up. I must admit I really struggled with this lesson. He'll tell me afterwards whether it was any good or not. She always does. Usually says it's good, fortunately, but she occasionally says that was a bit of a, not in a critical way, just she'll let me know that I made a mistake somewhere. I'm not trying to criticise. It's good to have someone say that sort of thing. It's an unusual book, to say the least. I had to read it a few times before I kind of got the gist of what was going on in the book. And that's what I've tried to do, is help you understand. It is a book in the Bible, so it is one we need to understand. So we'll carry on. I'll finish the second part of the notes in 2 weeks. If you wouldn't mind bringing the notes back next time, I'll have a couple of sets, but I don't want to reprint them all again. One problem I had in my head, I went to print the material out, and my printer blew up. I had to go ahead and get another printer, so that was another problem. But anyway, we got there in the end, so I appreciate everyone's attention. One guide of whether I'm getting across to people is if Rod looks like he's understanding it. Most of that, he looked pretty happy with it. That's encouraging.